Hello, welcome to Pastor with Dave Stone. I'm Dave Stone. You probably figured that out, but thank you for joining us. My dad used to say to me if I was a little bit groggy in the morning and I was just waking up and he had to say, get up several times. Then he would come in and he would say, hey, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And I wasn't as chipper as he was at that time. And I don't know if you are a little groggy. Maybe you're listening to this early in the morning. Perhaps it's late in the day and you're a little bit tired. Whatever the setting is, thank you for joining us. I promise you, I guarantee you that you will be encouraged and you will be inspired by our podcast today. By the way, if you don't follow us on Instagram, I would encourage you go to Pastor to Pastor Podcast. You can do that right now and follow us on there. That way you'll see some past clips and some future clips. You can also follow us on YouTube, subscribe there as well. The Focused Pastor channel is where you can find us there. But you can listen, of course, on any platform that you listen to podcasts. And today we're going to talk about boundaries. And this is really important because for you as a church leader, boundaries or the lack thereof can have a massive impact on your mental health and on your family and on your ministry. And so it's vital that we get this right. And our guest today is Kevin Thompson. And Kevin is an expert on boundaries. He is the marriage and family pastor at Bayside Church in Northern California. He's written several books, including his latest, Stay in Your Lane. Worry less, love more, and get things done. He's got so much wisdom to share on this topic. Let's listen in to our conversation with Kevin. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for being a part of this. I've really looked forward to this. The more that I've learned about you and the great church that you're a part of, I know that God's using you in a great way. So thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Dave, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be with you.
Now, I know you've had a lot of ministry experience. You've had a lot of years in Arkansas and now in California. What's the difference you've experienced going from Arkansas to Northern California?
Yeah, Dave, the biggest cultural shock we've had so far is how little of a cultural shock we've actually had. And so
Really?
I think we came prepared for a dramatic change. And so far, we haven't experienced that. Now, part of that is geographically where we are. Growing up in Arkansas, I had no idea that this part of California existed. You think California, I just think LA and San Francisco. And we are in a unique aspect here north of Sacramento, where it just has a different feel than what you would think in the rest of the state. But then beyond that, let's face it, people are people, and the gospel is the gospel. And so there's different flavors, no doubt, of what different sinfulness levels are as far as what the struggle might be. But the struggle of our basic humanity is the same. And so if you love people, I think you'll love Northern California just as much as you love Arkansas.
That's a great way to say it. And we had a guest a few weeks ago, Judd and Lori Wilhite from Las Vegas, and they kind of said the same thing. Sin, the list of sins might be different in all the different locales, but the root problem is that there's a desire for us to do what we want to do and to put ourselves on the throne rather than God. So I'd love to talk a little bit about your book because the title of it, Stay in Your Lane, is such a great title. And I know that it talks a lot about boundaries. I think the subtitle is Worry Less, Love More, and Get Things Done. And that's something that every one of us would love to have all of those three parts in our lives. When you think about the boundaries that you've had to set up in ministry, what have you benefited from as far as those boundaries that you've set up? And what does it mean to stay in your lane?
Yeah, Dave, it's the simplest book you've read since Goodnight Moon. It really is kind of ridiculous that we put this in print form, and yet it is so useful to people. So how this came about is for years, and I don't even know where it started exactly, but for years when I was counseling with individuals, when I was at a restaurant, just talking to CEOs, salespeople, all this kind of thing, they would start telling me about their issues, and I would inevitably grab a napkin, draw a couple lines, making 3 columns, and just say, hey, let's look at this and ask three questions. What's mine? What's theirs? What's God's? And basically, if we can begin to clarify and control what's mine, influence what's theirs, and accept what's God's. So control, influence, accept. I call that the CIA. You need to know the CIA because the CIA knows you, right? And so I think if we can figure out how to do that, it just brings this clarity that assists with relationships, that really does begin to minimize some anxiety, and it tells you what your next step is. But what I have found pastorally, maybe as much as any place, is we get so fixated on other people and the things that we can't control that many times it kind of shackles us in so many ways. Well, one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, after the resurrection, all right, Jesus is restoring Peter. They're walking on the beach, and the passage, he asked him three times, do you love me? And of course, Peter says yes. And then the text says that Jesus told Peter that whenever you were young, you went wherever you wanted to go. Wherever you're old, somebody else will lead you. And the text says Jesus told him that to tell him how he would die. So think about this. You're walking on the beach with Jesus. He is prophesying your future to you. And the very first question Peter asked was, looking at John, what's going to happen to him? And which I think is the perfect example now of who we are as human beings, but I think even who we are as pastors and ministers. You think about it, you'll have this great Easter Sunday, right? It's so good. And then you get home that afternoon and you start scrolling social media and you're looking at all these families post their beautiful pictures. And literally what pastors are doing is looking, what backdrop is that? Where do they go to church now? Have they entered the transfer portal? And I didn't know it. And so we get so fixated on what other people are doing that it really does inhibit us from controlling all the things that God has given us to control. And what amazes me, and I'm a big believer in the sovereignty of God, what amazes me is how much control God has given me over my own life. And yet so often I push that to the side and then I fixate on all these other things. And that's often how I get stuck.
Yeah, and we get wrapped up in trying to control the things that we can't control and making those comparisons with others in ministry. I've certainly been guilty of it. Not too long ago, we had Kyle Eidelman on here, and Kyle, when we were talking about comparisons, made a great point. He said, our tendency is to do one of two things. He said, we will compare our strengths to the weaknesses of others and we'll feel pride, or we'll compare our weaknesses to the strengths of others and we'll feel insecurity. And there are only so many things that we can be gifted at. And there are some 5 talent people. I'm probably more in that 1 or 2 talent category. But if we start comparing ourselves to others rather than following the grain in our own wood and being the person that God has called us to be, I think we kind of lose sight of what God has planned for us. And sometimes I'll say to people, God made us all originals, and yet we spend all of our lives trying to be copies, trying to be like everyone else and playing that comparison game. But if we're staying in our lane, then we're fixated and focused on the author and perfecter of our faith. We're going after serving him, and we're using our talents and gifts to the best of our abilities. Now, you've got a lot of people who are listening right now, men and women, who lead in churches, serve in churches. Maybe they're a key volunteer. Maybe they're a pastor on the staff. What are some boundaries that are healthy for Christian lay leaders and staff to put up for themselves?
Yeah, one thing I think that we often don't think about in this concept of even boundaries is, and within the idea of stay in your lane, my senior pastor here is Ray Johnston. He wrote the Hope Quotient. Such an encouraging person. And one thing he always talks about is it's the leader's responsibility to always be the most encouraged person in the room. And what we often do is we often outsource our level of encouragement to other people. And so instead of owning it ourselves, instead of saying, all right, my heart actually now belongs to me. It's my responsibility before God to make sure that I am inundated with scripture, inundated with hope, to make sure that I am reminded of God's call on my life, why he has placed me in this geographic location, at this generation, at this very moment, and to live in the stream of God's goodness. and take that wherever we go. But what we so often do is we actually outsource our level of hope to other people, to our favorite news channel.
Hmm.
And so the first thing we do of a morning is we begin to scroll to see, and let's face it, if the stock market is up, if our church numbers are up, if our compliments are up, we feel encouraged. If the email came in that was negative, if our 401 hypothetically is tanking, I mean, that would never happen,
Oh,
then
no,
we're
no,
then we're
not this
suddenly
spring.
discouraged. And so a boundary, one thing you can think about as a boundary is I'm going to make sure every day that I set aside time to where my heart is encouraged
Hmm.
so that whatever room I walk into as a leader, I'm going to be the most encouraged person in the room. Not living in denial of the hardships or the difficulties of life, but to have at the forefront the idea of the gospel and who God has called me to be. Now, obviously, then beyond that, there's all sorts of boundaries. I now have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, and so I'm in a different stage of life. But when my kids were little, some things were non-negotiable for me. I would not miss dinner time. I would not miss bedtime. If I were at the hospital with a situation, I would run home. I would eat with the family. I'd come back to the hospital. I might tell them, depending on how old our kids were, hey, I'll be right back. I'm going to go put my kids to bed and I'll come back. Uh, I just wanted to spend that time. That was a boundary that
Hmm.
I had. Little things that I have,
Good.
for instance, with my wife, is my cell phone. Uh, my cell phone, I never put face down on the table. It's always face up. And look, people text me things, and I just tell people, make sure your first line is not that revealing. So wait till it gets into the later, because I'm going to leave, because I never want my wife
Yeah.
to wonder or question or think, man, that's something weird there. So I think there's all
Mhm.
sorts of things that we can put into place with this idea of again, what is it that I control? And I'm going to take full responsibility for that. And then everything else I'm going to look at from a secondary kind of picture and influence where I can influence and obviously accept what I can accept, but to make sure that I'm controlling what I control first and foremost.
Now, I love what you said about dinner time because everyone who's in pastoral leadership, it's not a 9 to 5. It's like a doctor in the sense you are on call, and yes, you can put your phone on do not disturb and have those times when they can't get to you. But there are crises that pop up in the life of families, and whether it's health or whether it's marital problems, whatever it might be. And yes, we do want to respond to those things, but we want to make certain that our first congregation is our family and that we're making certain that we have those good boundaries. You talk about dinner time, and there was a study done years ago. They followed 60 families around. I think it was Harvard that commissioned this study. And what they found was that families that ate together for dinner, I think it was 4 or 5 times a week, then the odds of that child being in National Honor Society skyrocketed, them being in student government and being in leadership skyrocketed. They also found that they were 4 times less likely to be obese, 3 times less likely to experiment with drugs, with alcohol. All these incredible benefits that came just from sitting around the table. In fact, they even found that the presidents, there was one common thread with presidents of the United States, and it was that they ate dinner together as a family. And so it's crazy to think something so small could bear so much fruits, and yet just making that a priority. I've never found a person that had a hard time when I said, you know what, I've got to take this call. It's a family member, and this is the second time they've called, and I'm going to take it if that's all right with you. And people, I've found, respect things like that when we do set those boundaries.
Yeah, and dinner time really is a cornerstone habit. You think it's one of those habits that has a ripple effect in so many other ways. And
Hmm.
look, I completely understand. Different ministries demand different things. So I'm currently at a very large church. I don't think I would have worked at this church when my kids were little, because of the
Hmm.
demand and the schedule that is there. I intentionally wanted to be in a different place in a different position, where I did have a little bit more control over my schedule. And no critique of those who aren't in that
Yeah.
ability or something like that. But you recognize, how can we make this work in the setting that we're currently at? I now have a daughter at college. I have a junior in high school. He works a lot of nights here at the church, actually. And so that routine that once was so integral to us has
Hmm.
now changed. And so what that looks like now is every single Friday, my son and I go to lunch after he gets out of
Hmm.
school. It is just a non-negotiable thing to make sure that we have that time, because we don't have the time that we used to have. But it really is, especially if your kids are little, dinner time really is a cornerstone habit that then has a ripple effect in ways that we can't even begin to see.
Well, I can tell you're a good dad just by talking with you. How long have you and Jenny been married?
So it'll be 25 years here in just a couple of months.
Awesome. That's a great example. And while we're on that family trail, you say you've got a son and daughter. I think it's Silas and Ella. Ella has some special needs, and I know you have written and talked about some of the greatest takeaways that you found in leadership from being a parent to a special need daughter. Share a little bit of some of those insights that you've gleaned from something that you probably wouldn't have asked God for, but yet God has worked in incredible ways through this.
Yeah, so Ella's 19 and she has Down syndrome. We did not know prior to her birth. Matter of fact, I remember the test that whenever they came back and that, they do all sorts of tests at, let's say, 6 months, and the doctor walking in and saying, hey, Ella doesn't have this and doesn't have this and doesn't have Down syndrome and doesn't have this. So we were a rare kind of false negative in that scenario. But Ella was born 19 years ago. Doctor walks in on that Friday night. He was actually my pediatrician as a kid. And so now he was going to be Ella's pediatrician as well, and gave the diagnosis. And he did it brilliantly, by the way, very loving. It was great. And so he eventually left the room. They obviously took Ella to the nursery. I walked over to Jenny, and now this is Jenny's first response after getting this life-changing diagnosis. And Jenny's words were, well, this is a road we never would have chosen to go down, but I bet you we never regret going down it. And so the picture I get of that is that's Jenny with open hands saying, okay, God, we don't control this. You do,
Yeah.
but we will gladly accept what you have chosen with a trust that this is now the pathway that will most transform our hearts and will most use us for the good of your kingdom. And so that's the mindset that we've had that comes from my wife just from day one. And Ella has been a tremendous blessing in so many ways. It's funny, people hear, oh, you have a daughter with Down syndrome, and they will say, oh, they're the most loving people ever. And I'm like, yeah, most are. Ella will punch in the face. Like she has no hesitation. There is nobody more brutally honest with me. If you'll go on Instagram, so Kevin_A_Thompson Instagram, I'll post something. It is not unusual for Ella to respond with, nobody cares about this, Dad. And so she's quick to remind you. And yet what I love is in so many ways, you have a child and you think, man, it's my job to teach them everything. And let's face it, Ella's name, Ella Catherine Thompson. Ella's my grandmother's name. Ella Catherine Thompson, in part, was chosen because all great writers have three names. And this will look good on a book. And literally, I'm holding Ella in my arms before the diagnosis. And I just find myself praying, God, let me be the best dad to her that I can be, not trying to force my way on her. But just wherever you want to take this child, let me guide her in that direction. And within 2 hours, we get this diagnosis, and suddenly that prayer becomes radically different. And so from that point, it's really been that. I think in many ways, Jesus taught us that the way toward leadership is one of humility and one of service. And that literally, I think we learn leadership from sources that other people often overlook. And there are no doubt there are some ways that Ella experiences some negative consequences of her condition, and one day when she's in heaven, that will be taken away. But Dave, here's the thing: I don't know how many chromosomes we're going to have in heaven, because there are some ways in which Ella is already more like Jesus than I am, and I'm trying to become more like her, even at some other places. We're trying to work on some things. And so I think there's a community out there that can teach us what it means to be human, what it means to love, what's truly important. Let's face it, with Ella, I've never worried about her grade point. I've never worried about her performance on a softball field. I just want to make sure that Ella is loved, is confident, is experiencing who God has made her to be, and not in any way ashamed at what she lacks, and is just moving forward. And let's face it, most of the things I'm trying to convince Ella of, I need to convince myself of as well, because our listeners can get so wrapped into the scoreboard of church life, and instead of the idea of who God has made us, and to live in the overflow of his goodness in the midst of the world that he's placed us in.
Thanks for sharing that. And if you're listening right now, wherever you might be, riding in your car, or maybe sitting behind your desk, or out for a walk or a jog, I mean, you're thinking of a person right now, an Ella in your life, and it might be someone within your church who you've learned some great leadership lessons from. It might be someone in your home who might seem like an unlikely candidate for mentoring you, but the life lessons that you're getting from them, because of the way that they do things, the way they see things, the different perspective, just like Ella has. I got to say, Kevin, that you and Jenny both, from the outset, it sounds like in that first hour, it gets me choked up thinking about it, of just before you heard that news from that pediatrician who loved you guys so much, and yet that was the way that your wife looked at things, from a positive bent of saying, we wouldn't have chosen this road, but there's going to be some great things that come out of this. And just the fact that we have in our own minds what we think that our kids are going to grow up and do, and it doesn't always look like that when they get a little bit older, and we see that God has a different plan, and he's unfolding it. So thanks so much for giving us a peek into your life.
Dave, there's one more story about that I think is very important. And I love that idea.
We love stories.
We never know where God's going to take our kids, right? So
yeah.
Ella is 19, and she is actually at the University of California, Davis, living on campus in a very unique program called the Redwood Seed Program. And the idea is Davis, California is not a place that redwood trees tend to grow. But years ago, they planted a grove of them, and they nurtured them. And now these trees are growing in a place that normally doesn't happen. And so this program is built on the idea of a college campus is not a place that normally you see young adults with special needs. But if we will nourish them, they can actually flourish in this climate and then add to the culture that is around. And that's exactly what's happening there at UC Davis. And Ella is a year in now to this 4-year program. She doesn't get college credit, but she's having the full college experience, taking classes, interning, learning job skills, living on her own. I mean, it's kind of scary, but a couple of weeks ago on a Friday night, her and her roommate were kind of lost in downtown Davis on a Friday night at 10:30 at night. And, we're an hour away, kind of tracking her with our phone, saying, hey, here's where you need to go, and here's what you need to do. It's just been a beautiful thing. But here's what I love. Had you told me 15 years ago that I would have one child at one of the top 10 public universities in America, and then I would have another child who, after high school, is probably not looking at college, I would have said, well, of course. My son is very bright. Of course, he's going to go to a major university. Ella obviously won't have that opportunity. She'll be looking at other things. But now, my son, a junior in high school, he's looking at going to trade school, becoming an electrician, which I fully support and love and think that'll be a great thing for him. But it's my daughter with Down syndrome who's in college. And so I think it's this reminder from a parenting perspective of, look, you don't know what God's path is for your child. And I think especially for pastors, we can feel such a pressure, and church leaders, we can feel such a pressure to manipulate an outcome for our kids, failing to realize parenting is much more whitewater rafting. We're just trying to navigate the river and keep everybody alive. And then,
Yeah.
you know what? The water will go where it will go, and we'll do the best to try to protect our kids from some stuff, rescue them from some other things. But in the end, their story is between them and God, and it's not something that we're meant to
Hmm.
control.
Well, that's good. That's such great stuff. It's just a reminder of, his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are
Mhm.
higher than our thoughts. And so we hold on to the fact that, okay, he's got the big picture. And you're right. We would have looked at things totally different, and we would have thought this would happen, this would play out this way, and that would play out that way. But God has other plans. You've alluded a couple of different times to some of the metrics and the way we look at church world. And I know that you've written about this some, and it plays into our own mindset here in Western civilization of we like to measure by numbers. We like to measure by how good things are at our church, what the Easter attendance was. And yet there's a different metric that God seems to look at. What are some of the things that you noticed in over 20 years of ministry, being in Arkansas for a number of years and now in California working with married couples? What are the things that are different that have played out to you as far as, oh, this is really what God's looking for in Christian leaders?
Yeah, it's interesting now to have been here almost 4 years and not in the senior leadership position. I run the Married Life Ministry. Then I'm a teaching pastor that gets to rotate around to our campuses. But I feel like I'm in a daily kind of leadership seminar with Ray Johnston and Mark Clark and these other great leaders that we have. And it's interesting to look back now in my experience as a lead pastor in Arkansas, on staff for 19 years, lead pastor for 13 years of a church about 1,800, 4 locations. And it's interesting to look back and critique what would I have done differently. And I do think, obviously, as a senior leader, we do look at numbers, and rightly so. We need
Hmm.
to. Every number is a person, and that matters, no question.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating how much of our identity can get wrapped into that. I used to joke with our administrators on Monday morning. I would walk in, and basically I was asking the question, how many people do we have on Sunday? What was the offering? And I would jokingly say, how is my self-worth today? And 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 then they would say, hey, we had 1,800 people. The offering was this. I'm like, all right, that's okay. But I think we all know at the core of who we are what it is that God actually wants. He wants us to make the most of him, to be used by him, to see the transformation in the lives and the hearts of other people, but to know that we are not ultimately in control of that. We influence that. My basic definition
Hmm.
of leadership is that leadership is the influence of others through the transformation of self. And so
Wow.
the way that I can impact the way that I can influence others, I
Can
can't
you say
control
that
them.
one more time in case somebody's wanting to hear that as they're driving and they're writing it down?
Yeah, so leadership to me, so you think about John Maxwell will say that leadership is influence, which I think is a
Right.
brilliant idea.
Yeah.
I'm going to add to that and say that leadership is the influence of others through the transformation of self. And so basically the only thing I really control is me anyway. And so if I want to influence others, the only thing I can ultimately do is keep on allowing God to transform me and hope that then his spirit will take that and to be an influence to others. But ultimately, that's between them and
Hmm.
God. And so I just look at every situation within church life and just Christian leadership in general of, okay, I mean, think about it. It goes back to kind of our viewpoint of Ella, right? This diagnosis came, okay, this is God's pathway to make much of him, but also to change us. And so whenever we would face something in the
Good.
church or whatever was going on, it was, okay, Kevin, how do you need to change here? How can you grow? How can you mature? What are the new skills that you need to learn? Now, I'll never forget. I don't know if you remember the day the stock market didn't open because of COVID. I was
Hmm.
sitting in a meeting on that Thursday, I believe it was a Thursday, sitting in a meeting, and we were about to launch a $2 million capital campaign, which for us would have been huge. It's a campaign. I had never led a campaign before. I was about to have to do that, right? Well, the stock market doesn't open. I look at the people around me. I go, guys, this meeting's useless. We have no idea what the economy is about to do, and we're going to delay it for however long. what's interesting to me in staying in contact with my former church in Arkansas, they just now completed some of the things that we were in that meeting for that day. But my point is, in that meeting, I was trying to learn. The church needed something. Well, I needed to learn a new skill to do that. I
Hmm.
didn't know what it meant to lead a capital campaign. I have no idea. What does the church need from me? They need me to learn and to grow. And as I'm doing so, then I can lead them and influence them in a positive way. And I think if we're not very careful from a church leadership standpoint, we can get so fixated on what other people need to do. And if they would just do this, if they would just do that, then church would be better and life would be better. And no doubt there's a responsibility there, but we don't control that. What do we control? We control ourselves, and let's allow God to use us, and then we can begin to influence them as well.
Yeah. It starts with staying in your lane and doing what you can do. And before you start making expectations of others, it begins with us. You've talked a little bit about boundaries that we need to have within the family. Let's talk to Christian leaders about some of the boundaries that they need to have, clear boundaries with church members on, at times, what might appear to be, unkind or uncaring, and yet they're healthy boundaries that a pastor or someone in ministry needs to have. What are some things that you would say to encourage and challenge those who are listening who are in Christian leadership?
Yeah, I think it's a very natural boundaries if you're married, specifically to make sure not only to protect yourself, but then also to protect the perception of others. And I always think about Jenny. I just want Jenny to be confident at all times. But I want to talk about a boundary we often don't think about, and that is this. I want to allow a church member or somebody I'm working with, I want to draw a boundary where their emotions belong to them and not to me.
Hmm.
If I'm not very careful, I can kind of live in an anxious attachment, kind of codependent way. I'll never forget, years ago, we had counselors who worked there at our church in Arkansas. And one day one of them walked in and I said, "Hey, how are we today?" And she stopped. She looked at me and she goes, "How are we today?" What an interesting question. Doesn't that
Hmm.
show, Kevin, that what you're actually doing is you're waiting to find out how I'm doing to figure out how you're doing? And if I'm doing good, you're doing good. If I'm doing bad, you're not doing bad. That you have actually outsourced your emotion to me in that very moment. And your question just revealed that. And I was like,
Wow.
"Oh, hang on. I was just saying good morning." Now, she was joking with me, but she wasn't, because
Hmm.
she knows me. And she knows, as church leaders, we can
Hmm.
be people pleasers. And what we're actually doing is we can actually outsource our own well-being into the hands of other people, into a deacon board, into whoever our main critic is on a Sunday morning, into whoever's hurting the most. And we can literally outsource our identity to others. It's interesting, and we talk a lot about boundaries and opposite sex relationships and children, and rightly so, and we have to do that. We also need to draw boundaries around our own heart whenever it
Hmm.
comes to allowing God to define us more than allowing other people to define us. And again, that comes back to now controlling what we actually control.
That's a great point. And I love the fact that you're getting at the root and the core of, again, what you started with, and that is that control piece of control the things that we can. Don't allow somebody else to dictate how we feel, whether it's the mood that we're in, whether it's a perspective that we have, whether it's the numbers that are going on at church. I'm reminded what Craig Groeschel says when he talks about the metrics, and he says sometimes we can tend to take the credit when the numbers go up at a church, but he said be careful, because then you'll tend to blame yourself when the numbers go down. And sometimes those metrics have very little to do with our leadership. It has everything to do with what's going on in the life of that community. Your point about that woman goes back to the fact that you said control what you can control yourself. Don't let somebody else dictate your emotions or how you feel based upon how it is that they're feeling. You've written and you've talked at times about outcomes, and what matters is the process, and that's what is important to the outcomes. I know you've talked about this with parenting. You've talked about this with leadership. What are some important processes that we need to have within ministry that would be healthy to lead to what we see as a good outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously I'm a preacher, and so I think about this. Early on in ministry, I just found myself judging a sermon based on comments afterwards.
Hmm.
And it took a few years until I began to realize that when somebody says that's the greatest sermon I ever heard, one, sometimes they're lying. And then two, that probably just means they needed to hear that sermon more than others at that point. And so I kind of created a basic idea of as soon as I say amen, and back in Arkansas, I would have 3 steps down to the front row. I would say amen. I would take those 3 or 4 steps. And as I'm walking down those steps, I would think to myself, okay, Kevin, did you do your job or not? And by that,
Hmm.
what I was saying is, did you prepare properly this past week to give your best for God in this moment? And if
Hmm.
the answer is yes, great. Whatever the comments are, the comments are. If the answer is no, okay, own that. And whatever the comments are, the comments are. But don't get caught up in that. So I think from a
Hmm.
preaching standpoint, so much of what I look at is the process of preparation, is the process of my heart and perspective. Did I do that right? Then any given sermon can go, who knows how it's going to go, and who knows if I'm even going to have a good feel for that. And so then I think the question then becomes in church leadership in whatever role you're doing. So I'm a married life pastor that's here. And so I'm in a season now. We just came out of doing 6 straight weeks of a big class that we do, 600 people on a Wednesday night. It's a great
Wow.
time. I'm now kind of in a gap before we do our next thing. Well, this is a season of preparation. This is when
Yeah.
I read and study and learn and write new things. And okay, I have to make sure that I'm doing that process now, or the next class is not going to go that well. And so to look at even from a year-long seasonal perspective, what do I need to fixate and do this
Hmm.
season so that the next one is to come? I don't think it's any accident, right? You have the whole picture of the 4 seasons. We need to live those within our own lives. That there is this planting season where you're just fixated on getting the seed in the ground, and then there is this growing
Huh.
process. Well, then there is this harvest. Well, then there's come this time of rest. Are we making sure that from an annual perspective that we're living out all 4 of those types of seasons? Because here's my fear, Dave, is I can see this in the 20-something years I've been in ministry. There was a time in which summer we had a break. There was a time in which kind of in the winter time, there was this lull maybe after Christmas before those are gone. I
They
think
are.
I think I think May has become busier than December for a lot of people. That there is a grind now of, I mean, where I'm at, we talk about we want to own the summer for the kids, and so literally we will have 8,000 kids on our campus for a couple of weeks in June, and it's great ministry. But here's the thing: if you are not being
Hmm.
intentional to say what is not just my week of vacation, what is my season in which I get to throttle it back just a little bit? I remember I grew up, my dad's was an accountant. Well, from December to
Hmm.
April 15th, you knew dad was going to
Yeah.
be gone on Saturday morning. Dad wasn't getting home from work until after 6 o'clock. You knew. But you know what you knew on April 16th? Dad's home at 5. You could go play golf after work. There was this
Yeah.
clear season, and it allowed me as a child to say, okay, great. Man, this is a hard time, but I know this is coming. Not only do our families deserve that, we need that to make sure that there is an actual rhythm within our ministry lives. And I think it is a lie from ourselves or from our enemy to say that we can no longer do that. I think there is a basic need for our own humanity to live in that rhythmic kind of way.
Yeah, that's a great place for us to wrap up. And here's why, because all throughout this entire talk today, this conversation that we've had, it's all been about healthy rhythms, whether it's talking about boundaries, whether it's talking about time management in ministry or with our family. It has to have that rhythm to it, and it has to be a God-honoring rhythm. And I'm grateful for the fact that you have modeled this. You've been very transparent in areas maybe that have been a struggle for you, or it's taken some time to get to that point, but it's obvious that God has done a work in your life and in your family and now in your church out there at Bayside. I know that God's using you in a great way. You've given us some great food for thought. And as a pastor who struggles with some of those boundaries of not being a workaholic and turning off the faucet and just relaxing and resting and using those times of preparation has been really healthy for me. So thanks so much, Kevin. Check out changetheodds.com. Make certain you get a copy of Stay in Your Lane, and follow Kevin and find out all the great things that are taking place there in California.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Thanks, Kevin. Wow. Thank you, Kevin, because there are so many different things that I got out of this. I love those basics for boundaries and how we can summarize that CIA. Control what's mine, influence what's theirs, and accept what's God's. I need that as he just talks about the sovereignty that God has given us over our own lives. And then when he talked and shared about leadership as the influence of others through the transformation of self. I don't think I've ever heard a definition that good of leadership, and it unpacks it a little more deeply than I've heard before. And of course, that section where he gave us a peek into his heart and into his family's life, and when he and Jenny received the news from the doctor that their daughter Ella had Down syndrome. And I want to make certain I get this right. Jenny's words were, well, this is a road that we never would have chosen to go down, but I bet you we never regret going down it. And as I heard that, I thought about that from a family perspective, but it also took me on the mindset and the route of thinking of ministry, because some of you find yourself going down a road that you never would have chosen. Maybe you're serving at a church that you didn't think that you would be staying at long term, or it's very different ministry than what you thought God would plant you in. And yet he has you there for such a time as this. And it's because he wants to use you in the future, and he doesn't want you to be held back, looking back at what might have been, but instead he wants to get your eyes looking forward. The story for today comes from a friend of mine, Steve Reeves, who pastored in Indiana for a very long time. And he tells the story of a woman in his church that had a very delicate surgery that was going to take place. And as a result of that, the surgeon that was going to be operating on her brain talked to her the day before and said, hey, I don't anticipate any problems, but I do want to know which side I should be going in, because if I do encounter any problems, it's such a delicate surgery that you could run the risk of losing either your eyesight or your memory. And he said, I just want to know which one you would be willing to part with if I got in there and ran into any problems and discovered something. And she said, well, let me think about it and let me pray about it. And the next day before the surgery, he asked her again and said, again, I don't anticipate any problems or issues, but which would you be willing to do without if I did run into any snags? And she said, I've thought about it. And she said, I think I would rather lose my memory than my eyesight. And he said, okay, all right, thank you. That's helpful for me just to know where I'm going to come into that tissue. But he said, if you don't mind me asking, how was it that you determined that? And how did you come to that decision? She said, oh, I don't mind you asking at all. She said, after a while of prayer, I finally landed on this. I would rather see where I'm going than remember where I've been. And that's where all of us are. God wants us to be living in the present and living in the future so that we're taking steps right now, because you know what? We don't know what road we'll go down, and we don't know where God's going to lead us, but we'll never regret the fact that he's taken us there. But rather than dwelling upon the past and where he's taken us, what if we focused on today? What if we focused on what's taking place in the future rather than living in the past? You know, we are to learn from the past, but we're not to live in the past. And if you think about it, the Holy Spirit will never say tomorrow. The Holy Spirit will always say today. So be encouraged. Don't worry about the past. Don't worry about the road that God has you on. Instead, focus upon today and now, and let that propel you into the future. Well, a huge part of what we hope to accomplish with this podcast is to equip you both personally and professionally. And one way that we do that is through thefocusedpastor.org. You can join us there. You can create a free Focused Pastor account. You gain exclusive access to free resources. Plus, we give you a 50% discount off of everything in the Focused Pastor store. So sign up by heading over to thefocusedpastor.org or click the link below in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey. Let me remind you, every single Tuesday, we drop a brand new conversation on Pastor to Pastor. It is designed to encourage, inspire, and to challenge you, because leadership can be lonely. And we call this Pastor to Pastor for a reason. It's to remind you you're not alone. Until next time on Pastor to Pastor, I'm Dave Stone. God bless you.